Everything we know about human history is built on the assumption that our story is linear, that we rose slowly from ignorance, discovered fire, learned to shape stone, invented language, and finally built civilization step by step. But what if that story is not only incomplete, but deliberately simplified? What if civilization did not begin once, but many times, and each time it ended so violently that only fragments survived? Not legends, not fairy tales, but scars etched into the planet itself. Today, those scars are beginning to align, and the alignment is impossible to ignore. Across deserts, beneath oceans, and deep inside mountains, evidence keeps surfacing that does not fit the official timeline. Objects embedded in geological layers that predate humanity by millions of years. Ruins carved with precision that rivals modern engineering, yet buried under sediment laid down long before agriculture existed. Astronomical alignments that track skies no human should have ever seen. For decades, these discoveries were dismissed one by one. A mistake here, contamination there, a hoax, a misinterpretation. But the problem is no longer individual anomalies. The problem is quantity, consistency, and synchronization. When a single artifact appears out of place, it can be ignored. When dozens appear across continents, all violating history in the same way, something deeper is happening. It feels as though history itself is fracturing, not randomly, but along specific fault lines, revealing glimpses of worlds that came before ours. Worlds that rose, mastered their environment, and then vanished so completely that we mistook their remains for myth. What makes this unsettling is not just the existence of these anomalies, but their precision. They do not contradict history chaotically. They contradict it strategically. They appear at the edges of accepted knowledge, just far enough to be dismissed individually, yet together they form a pattern too sharp to be coincidence. It is as if entire chapters of the human story were erased, leaving behind only enough fragments to haunt those who stumble upon them. The deeper researchers look, the more synchronized these fractures become. Civilizations once thought isolated suddenly share impossible similarities. Identical geometries appear in structures separated by oceans. The same astronomical ratios surface in cultures with no known contact. Flood myths align with geological layers. Collapsed timelines overlap across continents. These are not echoes of a single lost city. They are the remnants of multiple lost worlds. And this is where the idea becomes truly destabilizing. What if there were not one, but 6 advanced civilizations before ours? 6 attempts at global order. 6 ages of knowledge, engineering, and organization that reached a threshold and were then erased. Not slowly, not gently, but abruptly, leaving behind a planet reset to near silence each time. The evidence for this does not come from one discipline. It emerges when geology, archaeology, astronomy, genetics, and mythology are viewed together. Ice cores reveal sudden climate shifts that happen too fast to be natural. Ocean sediments record massive floods striking multiple coastlines at once. Tree rings show decades of darkness compressed into a single season. Volcanic ash layers blanket entire hemispheres simultaneously. These signatures repeat at near regular intervals, like the ticking of a clock we never realized we were standing inside. Every time this clock struck, a civilization disappeared. What is most disturbing is what happens immediately after each collapse. In the archaeological record, there is no gradual decline, no long period of decay. Instead, there is silence. Centuries, sometimes millennia, where nothing comparable rises. And then, suddenly a new civilization appears, already possessing agriculture, astronomy, architecture, mathematics, and law. Not experimenting, not evolving, remembering. Ancient cultures themselves tell us this, if we listen carefully. They do not describe themselves as inventors. They describe themselves as restorers. Kingship is said to descend from heaven. Knowledge is said to come from before the flood. Temples are rebuilt exactly as they were in distant ages. Texts are copied from older texts whose origins are already forgotten. This is not the language of beginnings. It is the language of inheritance. Yet inheritance implies predecessors, and predecessors imply an ending. One of the most unsettling aspects of this pattern is how often evidence disappears just as it becomes undeniable. Artifacts are quietly removed from collections. Reports vanish from databases. Excavation permits are revoked without explanation. Images corrupt. Data goes missing. And this does not happen in one country or under one government. It happens everywhere, with the same efficiency, the same silence, the same result, as if an old protocol is still being followed. This raises a question few are willing to ask. If these civilizations existed, who benefited from erasing them? And more importantly, why does that erasure seem to accelerate every time the pattern begins to re-emerge? Because the most unsettling possibility is this. The evidence is not only about the past, it is about timing. The same signals that appear before ancient collapses are rising again today. The magnetic field weakens. The poles drift faster than ever recorded. Deep ocean currents slow. Volcanic systems stir. The night sky changes subtly, but measurably. These are not isolated warnings. They are echoes. Echoes of the same precursors that appeared before each lost world fell. If 6 civilizations rose and collapsed before ours, then everything we call ancient may simply be the first page of the final chapter. And the ruins we admire today may not be beginnings at all, but the last whispers of survivors who crawled out of a shattered world and tried to warn the future. Which brings us to the most dangerous question hidden beneath all of this. If entire worlds were erased before us, was it by accident? Or was it part of a cycle so old, so precise, that it resets civilization the moment it reaches a certain threshold? Because if that cycle exists, and if it is returning now, then humanity is not approaching its future. It is approaching a memory. The first clues were small enough to dismiss, easy to laugh off, easy to bury under the weight of conventional explanation. A single object found where it should not be, a measurement that did not align, a structure that seemed too precise for its supposed age. Each time, the response was the same: contamination, misdating, natural formation, human error. And for a long time, those explanations were enough, because accepting anything else would mean reopening the entire foundation of human history. But then the anomalies began to cluster. Deep inside a collapsed limestone shaft, far below any known human activity, explorers uncovered a metallic object no larger than a fist. Its edges were perfectly straight, its angles mathematically exact, not worn, not corroded, not cracked. The surrounding rock had formed millions of years ago, sealing the object inside an airtight tomb, long before the first hominids walked upright. The stone showed no fractures, no intrusion, no signs of manipulation. The metal had not been placed there after the fact. The rock had grown around it. At first, the discovery was treated as contamination, modern debris somehow falling into an ancient layer. But when geologists examined the strata, they found nothing disturbed. The layers were intact, undisturbed, continuous. The object did not belong to the timeline it was found in, and that alone should have been enough to stop everything. It wasn't. Within months, another object surfaced halfway across the world, embedded inside a coal seam formed from plant life hundreds of millions of years old. This time, it was a metallic sphere, flawlessly symmetrical, its surface resistant to oxidation, its composition unknown. Then a third, locked inside volcanic ash older than mammals themselves. 3 artifacts, 3 continents, 3 geological contexts that should never intersect. And yet they did, perfectly. The pattern was no longer dismissible. As reports circulated quietly between specialists, something strange happened. Access to the sites was restricted. Files were marked confidential. Images degraded. Samples were relocated. When researchers attempted to follow up, they found their permits revoked, their funding redirected, their communications unanswered. The discoveries did not fade into obscurity. They were removed. and removal implies intent. The deeper investigators pushed, the more they noticed a recurring feature. Every object shared an eerie similarity. They were engineered, not crude, not decorative. Their geometry suggested precision manufacturing. Their materials hinted at metallurgy beyond anything attributed to early humanity. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they were always sealed, hidden, placed where they would only be found by accident, as if deliberately buried beyond reach, beyond memory. This raised a question that no one wanted to voice publicly. Who hid them? As if in response, the evidence widened its scope. It was no longer confined to isolated artifacts. Entire structures began to emerge beneath the oceans. Off the coasts of Japan, India, the Mediterranean, sonar scans revealed staircases, terraces, and walls arranged in deliberate grids. These were not natural formations. Their angles were too precise, their symmetry too intentional. Divers reported standing on what felt like drowned avenues, stones fitted so tightly that even modern engineers struggled to explain their construction. Dating placed these structures at a time when sea levels were far lower, when vast regions now submerged would have been fertile land. And the timing aligned with something ancient cultures around the world had been trying to tell us for thousands of years. A flood, not a local disaster, a global event. The most unsettling detail was not the existence of these submerged cities, but their synchronicity. They did not sink one by one over centuries. Geological evidence suggested they were lost almost simultaneously. Coastlines across the planet drowned within a narrow window of time. Entire regions vanished beneath rising seas in what could only be described as a planetary catastrophe. And still, the similarities continued. Identical symbols appeared in ruins separated by oceans. Geometric motifs repeated with mathematical consistency. Astronomical alignments tracked star positions that only existed tens of thousands of years ago. Structures pointed not to the sky as it is now, but to a sky long gone, altered by Earth's slow axial drift. These builders were not guessing. They were measuring. The implications were staggering. Whoever constructed these sites possessed knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and Earth's cycles far beyond what mainstream history allows. And they applied that knowledge globally, not locally. This was not a collection of isolated cultures stumbling towards civilization. It was a system, and systems do not arise accidentally. As researchers compared notes across disciplines, a chilling pattern emerged. Each wave of anomalies corresponded to the same geological signatures. Sudden climate shocks recorded in ice cores, layers of ash and microglass from massive impacts, abrupt magnetic disturbances. Each signature appeared at regular intervals, like markers in a repeating sequence. And at every marker, evidence of advanced civilization vanished. It began to feel less like a series of disasters and more like resets. What made this even more disturbing was what followed each reset. After every collapse layer, there was a long silence, no gradual rebuilding, no transitional technology. And then, suddenly, civilization reappeared, fully formed. Agriculture, writing, architecture, law, astronomy, appearing almost overnight, with no clear developmental path. This is where ancient texts become impossible to ignore. Civilizations like Sumer did not claim to invent these systems. They claimed to receive them. Knowledge was said to come from before the flood. Kingship descended from a higher order. Cities were rebuilt on ancient foundations. Texts were copied from older texts whose origins were already lost. This is not mythological flourish. It is consistent testimony across cultures. They remembered something we have forgotten. But memory implies survival, and survival implies witnesses. The question then becomes not whether civilizations existed before ours, but how their story was carried forward. Stone can be shattered, cities can drown, knowledge written on clay can crumble. So how does a warning survive 6 global collapses? The answer may not lie in ruins at all, because as evidence continued to surface in the ground, another kind of anomaly emerged in the laboratory, one that could not be erased, relocated, or locked away. Something hidden not in stone, but in the human body itself. And that is where the story takes its most unsettling turn. Long before sonar traced drowned cities or satellites revealed buried grids beneath deserts, the most enduring evidence of the worlds before ours was already present, carried quietly through time inside the human body. It was not carved in stone or sealed in rock. It was written in biology. Geneticists originally encountered it as an inconvenience, a statistical anomaly that refused to disappear. Less than 0.5% of the global population carried a cluster of genetic traits that did not behave like normal mutations. They did not correlate with climate. They did not follow known migration routes. They did not align with any established branch of human ancestry. At first, researchers assumed contamination or misclassification, but the data persisted, clean, repeatable, and deeply unsettling. The same genetic signature appeared in places that should have had no connection at all. Isolated mountain communities in India, coastal tribes scattered across Southeast Asia, small populations in northern Australia, the Basque people of Western Europe. These groups shared no recent history, no linguistic roots, no cultural overlap. And yet, their DNA matched in ways that should have been impossible. What made the discovery even stranger was how the traits appeared. Not separately, not randomly. They arrived as a bundle, inherited together as if from a single ancient source. Enhanced tolerance to low oxygen, unusual endurance under prolonged physical stress, metabolic efficiency during periods of limited sunlight. But the most remarkable feature was neurological. Brain imaging revealed heightened activity in regions associated with spatial mapping, environmental awareness, and pattern recognition. Not learned skills, instinctive ones. The kind of awareness needed to navigate unfamiliar landscapes, track celestial movement, sense subtle environmental changes long before they become obvious. These were not traits optimized for comfort or civilization. They were optimized for survival during catastrophe. For a long time, scientists tried to explain these features through known mechanisms: high-altitude adaptation, interbreeding with archaic hominins, local environmental pressures. But none of those explanations held. The traits appeared in lowland regions, in coastal areas, in climates where such adaptations offered no advantage, and no known hominin lineage could account for the specific configuration of this genetic cluster. The uncomfortable implications slowly took shape. These traits did not evolve to meet local conditions. They evolved to endure collapse. As researchers mapped the distribution of this genetic signature, another pattern emerged. Every population carrying it lived near regions associated with ancient flood myths, sudden climate disruption, or evidence of rapid migration following environmental catastrophe. Highlands, caves, protected valleys, inland refuges far from drowned coastlines. These were not random settlements. They were safe zones, and the stories told by these communities reflected the same memory. Across continents, oral traditions spoke of a time when the sea rose without warning, when the sky darkened for years, when fire fell from above and cold followed close behind. Survivors fled to higher ground. Knowledge was preserved only in fragments. Skills were passed down without context. The world that existed before was remembered not by name, but by loss. These stories were never identical, but their structure was: a prosperous world, a sudden ending, a small remnant chosen not by power, but by circumstance, and a mandate, sometimes explicit, sometimes implied, to carry something forward: memory. What makes this genetic discovery so unsettling is not simply that it exists, but that it behaves as if it is waiting. Epigenetic markers on these sequences show signs of activation under specific environmental stresses: rising carbon dioxide, shifting magnetic fields, increased solar radiation, rapid climate instability, the same conditions recorded in geological layers preceding earlier global collapses. In other words, the genes respond when the world begins to resemble the world that ended before. This is not metaphor, it is measurable. Individuals carrying this cluster demonstrate heightened physiological response during geomagnetic storms, improved oxygen efficiency during atmospheric instability, increased neural coherence when exposed to certain frequencies, frequencies that happen to match resonant properties found in ancient stone chambers and megalithic structures. The implication is staggering. The survivors of a previous world did not only pass down stories, they passed down preparedness, a biological memory designed to endure when technology, cities, and written language could not. The human body became the archive. This reframes the entire question of human origins. If a portion of humanity carries traits inherited from survivors of a global collapse, then humanity did not begin at the dawn of civilization as we are taught. It re-emerged, and it did so guided not by invention, but by instinctual recall. Suddenly, the rapid reappearance of complex skills after long dark ages makes sense. The sudden emergence of agriculture, the immediate precision of early calendars, the appearance of megalithic construction without prototypes. These were not first attempts, they were reconstructions. But reconstructions of what? As researchers compared the neurological patterns of individuals carrying the genetic cluster with the geometry encoded in ancient monuments, another impossible alignment appeared. The same ratios, the same spatial relationships, the same mathematical constants repeated in both biology and architecture. It was as if the builders of the ancient world encoded their knowledge twice, once in stone, once in flesh. And if that is true, then the genetic memory awakening today is not a coincidence. It is a signal. The world is changing again. The question is no longer whether civilizations existed before ours. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is why their survivors believed the future would need these traits again. Because the past is not something buried behind us. It is something returning. As the genetic evidence pointed inward, toward memory carried in flesh, another line of investigation pointed outward, toward structures so large and so precise that they could not be dismissed as coincidence or primitive ingenuity. These were not the ruins people visit on postcards. These were the foundations beneath them, the parts rarely shown, rarely discussed, and almost never questioned. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites, they usually focus on the visible layers: temples, walls, carvings, statues. These are assigned dates, cultures, dynasties. But beneath those layers, buried deeper than ceremonial floors or burial chambers, lie structures that tell a very different story. And the deeper the excavation goes, the older and more advanced the construction becomes. This inversion should not exist. Technology does not normally degrade as time moves forward. Yet across the world, the most precise stonework appears at the deepest, oldest levels. Above it, later cultures build with smaller stones, looser joints, simpler techniques. It is not progress. It is decline. At Giza, the familiar pyramid casing stones are impressive, but they are not the real mystery. Beneath them lie core blocks weighing tens of tons, fitted with tolerances so tight that even today a blade cannot pass between them. The structure is aligned to true north with an accuracy that modern surveying equipment struggles to match. Not magnetic north. True north. An alignment that requires long-term astronomical observation and mathematical precision far beyond what the official builders should have possessed. Even more troubling are the internal passages. They encode ratios tied to Earth's circumference, axial tilt, and precessional cycle. These are not decorative features. They are measurements, a kind of planetary record. And Egypt is not unique. In Peru, massive polygonal walls at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo use stones weighing up to 100 tons, each cut into complex interlocking shapes. No two stones are the same. Each one fits its neighbors perfectly, forming walls that can withstand earthquakes that shatter modern buildings. The Inca themselves admitted they did not build these foundations. They inherited them. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe rewrote history not because of its age, but because of its implication. Monumental stone circles, carved with astronomical symbolism, appear at a time when humanity was supposedly incapable of agriculture, mathematics, or organized religion. Yet the builders planned, quarried, transported, and erected multi-ton pillars with deliberate alignment. Then, inexplicably, they buried the site themselves, sealing it beneath tons of earth, as if to hide it from the future. In Japan, underwater structures near Yonaguni reveal terraces, staircases, and flat platforms carved with right angles and symmetry that defy natural erosion. Divers report standing on what feel like streets and plazas, now submerged beneath the sea. Geological explanations struggle to account for the precision. In China, entire pyramid fields lie hidden beneath soil and forest, officially labeled burial mounds. Satellite imaging reveals geometric shapes, cardinal alignments, and chambered interiors beneath these hills. Excavation is restricted. Access is limited. The story remains incomplete. Across continents, cultures separated by oceans and millennia share the same architectural fingerprints: polygonal stonework, cyclopean blocks, astronomical alignment, seismic resistance, and always the same pattern. The oldest construction is the most advanced. When engineers study these structures, they notice something else. Many are built on fault lines, mineral-rich strata, or regions with unusual electromagnetic properties. Quartz-bearing stone is favored. Basalt is shaped with extreme precision. Chambers resonate at frequencies known to affect human consciousness and biological rhythms. These are not random temples. They appear designed to interact with the planet itself. As data accumulates, a disturbing possibility emerges. These monuments were not built by the cultures we credit with them. They were inherited, reused, repurposed by survivors who no longer fully understood their original function. Just as genetic memory preserved fragments of biological preparedness, these structures preserved fragments of planetary knowledge. They were anchors, markers, perhaps even stabilizers. And like the genetic cluster, they seem to respond to the present. Sensors placed near ancient sites record unusual acoustic resonance during solar storms. Magnetic fluctuations spike near megalithic complexes during geomagnetic events. Structures aligned to ancient skies are once again aligning as Earth's axial and magnetic conditions shift closer to those of the past. The monuments are not silent relics, they are instruments, which leads to a question that becomes harder to avoid the more evidence piles up. If these structures were engineered to endure catastrophe, then the civilization that built them did not expect permanence. They expected collapse. They were not building for eternity. They were building for recurrence. And if their knowledge survives both in stone and in the human genome, then these monuments were never meant to stand alone. They were meant to be recognized by those who carried the memory. The past did not vanish, it fragmented, and now, as Earth's systems begin to echo the same signals that preceded earlier endings, those fragments are beginning to align again. As the scale of the ancient structures became impossible to ignore, researchers began asking a question that shifted the entire investigation away from architecture and toward timing. Not when these monuments were built according to cultural history, but when they were positioned relative to Earth itself. Because stone does not only record human intention, it records planetary conditions. When scientists overlaid the locations of the oldest megalithic foundations onto global maps of tectonic stress, magnetic anomalies, and ancient coastlines, a pattern emerged that felt deeply unsettling. These structures were not scattered randomly across the world. They were placed with intention, following a logic that only makes sense if the builders understood Earth as a dynamic, changing system. Many of the oldest monuments sit precisely at the edges of ancient coastlines that no longer exist. During the last ice age, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. Vast continental shelves were exposed. Entire regions that are now ocean floor were once fertile land. When those ancient shorelines are reconstructed using geological data, the alignment is exact. Cities, temples, and stone platforms appear exactly where stable coastlines would have existed before catastrophic flooding. This alone suggests a level of environmental knowledge that challenges everything we assume about early humanity. But the pattern goes further. Other structures align not with modern magnetic north, but with a different pole position entirely. Paleomagnetic studies show that Earth's magnetic field has shifted repeatedly over time. The ancient builders appear to have known this. Some monuments align to magnetic north as it existed more than 12,000 years ago. Others appear to track changes in axial tilt encoding long-term celestial cycles that only complete over tens of thousands of years. These are not alignments you stumble into by chance. They require patient observation across generations, careful record-keeping, and mathematical modeling of planetary behavior. Whoever designed these sites was not reacting to the world. They were anticipating it. Even more disturbing is what happens when these timelines are compared to collapse layers in the geological record. Flood sediments, volcanic ash, microtectites from impacts, and sudden climate shifts cluster around the same periods encoded in the monuments. The structures are not just aligned to the heavens, they are synchronized with catastrophe. This suggests a civilization that understood something modern humanity is only beginning to grasp. Earth operates in cycles, and those cycles can become violent when multiple systems converge. Ocean circulation, solar radiation, tectonic pressure, magnetic stability. When these forces align, the planet does not adapt slowly, it resets. The ancient builders appear to have mapped these convergence points, which raises a chilling implication. The monuments were not celebrating a golden age. They were warning markers placed at specific moments in Earth's long rhythm. Physical timestamps carved into stone, designed to outlast memory, language, and culture. This explains another long-standing mystery. Why so many ancient sites were abandoned, buried, or sealed intentionally. Göbekli Tepe was not destroyed by enemies. It was carefully covered. Entire stone circles were filled in, preserved beneath layers of soil as if hidden from erosion or from time itself. Other sites show signs of deliberate closure. Entrances blocked, chambers sealed, knowledge locked away. This behavior does not fit the narrative of cultural collapse. It fits preparation. It suggests the builders knew their world was ending and understood that whatever followed would not be ready to understand what they left behind. So they chose endurance over explanation, stone over story, geometry over language. And this brings the investigation to an uncomfortable realization. If the monuments are synchronized with collapse cycles, and if Earth's current conditions are drifting towards similar convergence points, then we are not discovering these structures at random. We are encountering them at the moment they were meant to be encountered. The timing is not accidental. The same astronomical configurations encoded in stone are slowly returning. The same magnetic instability is reappearing. The same climate volatility is accelerating. And as these signals rise, human curiosity intensifies, technology accelerates, and buried knowledge resurfaces. It is as if the planet itself is turning a page. The ancient civilization did not leave us instructions on how to save their world. They left us evidence that worlds end, and that memory is the only thing that carries forward. Their monuments were never meant to preserve their civilization. They were meant to preserve awareness of the cycle. And now that awareness is returning, not as myth or legend, but as data, as pattern, as alignment between stone, sky, and biology. The question no longer feels theoretical, it feels imminent. As attention shifted from the monuments themselves to the people who built them, a deeper mystery surfaced, one that could not be measured with sonar, carbon dating, or satellite scans. It emerged from the human body, from biology, from patterns buried not in stone, but in blood. For decades, geneticists believed human variation followed a predictable map shaped by climate, migration, and natural selection. But as genome databases expanded, small inconsistencies began to appear, tiny clusters of genes that did not behave like normal mutations. They did not spread gradually. They did not follow migration routes. And most strangely, they appeared in populations that should have no connection to one another at all. These genetic markers surfaced among isolated mountain communities in South Asia, coastal tribes in Southeast Asia, remote groups in Northern Australia, and the Basque population of Western Europe. Different continents, different histories, different languages. Yet the same rare genetic signatures appeared again and again. At first, researchers assumed coincidence, then contamination, then statistical error. But the pattern refused to disappear. These markers were not random. They were bundled together, inherited as a package, as if they came from a single ancestral source rather than multiple evolutionary paths. And when scientists examined what these genes actually did, the results became even more unsettling. The traits they influenced were not cosmetic. They were functional. Enhanced tolerance to low oxygen environments, improved endurance under prolonged stress, metabolic efficiency during periods of limited sunlight, and most striking of all, heightened activity in regions of the brain associated with spatial awareness, pattern recognition, and environmental sensing. These are not advantages for peaceful, stable environments. They are survival traits, traits useful in worlds undergoing collapse, floods, ash-darkened skies, magnetic instability, long migrations across unfamiliar terrain, the exact conditions described in global catastrophe myths and encoded in the ancient monuments. What made this discovery truly disturbing was how these traits behaved. They remained mostly dormant for generations, barely noticeable. But under specific environmental stressors, rising atmospheric changes, geomagnetic fluctuations, climatic instability, their expression increased. Not slowly, but sharply. Epigenetic switches flipped on. In other words, these genes were not just inherited, they were waiting for the world to resemble the one they were designed to survive. This reframed the entire conversation about lost civilizations. Perhaps their greatest legacy was not architecture or technology. Perhaps it was continuity, a biological insurance policy carried forward by the survivors of collapse, encoded into the descendants who would one day face similar conditions again. This possibility explains something long overlooked: why ancient myths so often speak of chosen survivors, of lineages protected by gods, of people who carried sacred knowledge without fully understanding it. These stories may not be symbolic. They may be ancestral memory struggling to describe genetic inheritance. It also explains why these genetic clusters appear near regions associated with ancient refuges, highlands, caves, interior plateaus, places that would have remained habitable during floods, volcanic winters, and rapid climate shifts. The people who survived were not random. They were those whose biology could endure the transition. And now, as modern instruments detect the same planetary instability seen before previous collapses, those dormant traits are stirring again. This is not evolution accelerating. Evolution does not work on timescales of decades. This is recall, a biological echo responding to conditions it recognizes. The implications are staggering. If parts of humanity carry inherited survival memory from a world that ended before recorded history, then our species is not simply moving forward. We are looping through a pattern older than civilization itself. And that raises a question that is both hopeful and terrifying. If the last civilization prepared its descendants to survive the next collapse, did they also prepare them to do something different this time? Because survival alone is not progress, understanding is. As genetic evidence began to suggest continuity rather than coincidence, researchers turned back to the physical world with a new lens. If biological memory survived collapse, then architecture might have served the same purpose, not as shelter or worship, but as storage. Not storage of objects, but of information. Information designed to survive when language, writing, and culture failed. When engineers analyzed the oldest layers of megalithic sites, a strange consistency emerged. The most ancient construction phases were always the most precise. Later, cultures added decorations, repairs, symbolic carvings, but the foundational stonework was different in kind, not just in age. It followed rules that felt mathematical rather than cultural. Across continents, the same construction logic appeared. Polygonal blocks interlocked in ways that distributed seismic stress. Massive stones shaped to resonate at specific frequencies when struck or exposed to wind. Chambers aligned to amplify sound or channel vibration through bedrock. These were not artistic choices. They were engineering solutions. What unsettled researchers most was that many of these structures were built on geological fault lines, magnetic anomalies, or underground water systems, places modern engineers often avoid. Yet the ancient builders sought them out. When mapped together, these sites formed a loose global network, a lattice aligned with Earth's energetic systems rather than political boundaries. It began to look less like monument building and more like planetary instrumentation, Some structures appear designed to monitor changes, others to stabilize, others perhaps to signal. Acoustic tests revealed standing waves within chambers tuned to frequencies associated with tectonic movement. Infrasound measurements showed that certain sites responded to distant earthquakes before seismic instruments registered them. The implication is unsettling. These structures may not have been built to survive catastrophe. They may have been built to sense it coming. And when archaeologists examined sites like Göbekli Tepe more closely, the mystery deepened. The pillars are carved with symbols that do not tell stories. They repeat. Abstract animals, geometric forms, not narrative, but pattern. And then, inexplicably, the site was buried intentionally, carefully, methodically, as if sealed for later discovery. This behavior is not unique. Other ancient sites show similar treatment. Entrances blocked, chambers filled, knowledge entombed, not destroyed, which forces a shift in interpretation. These builders were not trying to pass knowledge directly to future civilizations. They were trying to delay it, to ensure it would only be rediscovered when humanity reached a certain stage of development. Stone lasts longer than language. Geometry lasts longer than belief, and geometry cannot lie. This explains why these sites feel timeless. Why cultures that inherited them often misunderstood their purpose but preserved them anyway. Why later civilizations built temples on top of foundations they could not replicate. They recognized the power of the place without understanding its function. It also explains why so many myths describe gods who taught knowledge and then disappeared. The teachers were not gods, they were survivors. Survivors who knew that explaining too much to a fragile civilization could be dangerous. That premature knowledge might accelerate collapse rather than prevent it, so they encoded what they knew into systems that required interpretation. Systems that would only reveal themselves when humanity had the tools to measure, model, and cross-reference. When stone, sky, and biology could be read together. And now, for the first time, those tools exist. The monuments are not relics of superstition. They are markers of timing, interfaces between Earth's cycles and human awareness. They waited while civilizations rose and fell above them, until the world once again approached a familiar threshold. The realization is quiet but profound. The ancient world did not fail to preserve its knowledge. It succeeded. It just chose patience over permanence. And now the responsibility has shifted, because once awareness returns, it cannot be buried again. As understanding spread across disciplines, geology, genetics, astronomy, engineering, a realization began to settle that was difficult to articulate, even harder to accept. The ancient world did not collapse in ignorance. It collapsed with awareness, and that distinction changes everything. When scientists reconstructed past climate transitions using ice cores and ocean sediments, they noticed something striking. The warning signs appeared centuries before each major collapse. Subtle temperature oscillations, irregular magnetic drift, shifts in atmospheric chemistry. The signals were there, but interpreting them required a planetary perspective no early civilization officially possessed. And yet the monuments suggest someone did. The builders did not react at the last moment. They prepared long before instability became obvious. That implies long-term observation, data accumulation across generations, and a shared understanding that Earth operates on rhythms far larger than human lifespans. These were not short-sighted societies driven by immediate survival. They were thinking in deep time. This reframes the meaning of the so-called golden ages described in ancient myths. Perhaps those periods of abundance were not simply times of prosperity, but final windows of stability, moments when knowledge was consolidated, structures were completed, and memory was encoded before the cycle turned. And then comes the most unsettling question of all. If they knew collapse was inevitable, why didn't they stop it? The answer may lie in the nature of the cycle itself. Some planetary processes cannot be halted. Magnetic reversals, orbital shifts, tectonic realignments, solar variability. These are not enemies to be defeated. They are fundamental behaviors of a living planet. To resist them directly would require energy and coordination beyond even an advanced civilization's reach. So instead of trying to prevent the cycle, The ancient world may have chosen a different strategy. Continuity over permanence. Preservation of knowledge rather than preservation of infrastructure. Survival of awareness rather than survival of cities. This explains why their greatest achievements are not palaces or weapons, but systems of encoding. Geometry carved into stone. Alignments fixed in landscape. Patterns replicated across continents. And most importantly, traits preserved in living descendants. They accepted that collapse would come. Their goal was to ensure that the next civilization would not be blind. This interpretation sheds new light on ancient flood myths and apocalypse stories. These were not warnings meant to frighten. They were records of process, descriptions of stages, fire, water, darkness, ice. Not moral judgments, but observations repeated across cycles. A kind of ancient scientific shorthand embedded in story. It also explains why so many cultures describe teachers who arrived after catastrophe, bringing agriculture, astronomy, and social organization. These were not miraculous inventions. They were fragments of recovered knowledge carried by survivors who understood just enough to restart civilization, but not enough to recreate what was lost. Each cycle left humanity slightly changed, slightly more prepared, slightly more aware, but never fully ready until now. For the first time, humanity can observe Earth as a system. We can track magnetic fields in real time, monitor solar activity, model ocean circulation, detect tectonic stress before rupture. We can compare current data to ancient records and see the pattern emerging again. This is the moment the monuments were waiting for, not the end of the world, but the return of recognition, the point at which memory and measurement converge. And that convergence creates a choice no previous civilization ever had, to repeat the cycle blindly or to engage with it consciously. The ancient world left us no manual, no step-by-step instructions, but they left something far more valuable. Proof that awareness can survive collapse, proof that preparation can outlast catastrophe, proof that humanity is not condemned to forget. What happens next depends not on technology alone, but on perception. Whether we continue to treat these patterns as coincidence, myth, or fringe speculation, or whether we accept that the past is not dead, not distant, not irrelevant. It is active, and it is asking something of us now. By the time this understanding fully takes shape, the story stops being about ancient civilizations and becomes uncomfortably present. Because once you recognize the cycle, you also begin to recognize yourself inside it. Every collapse before ours shared one final characteristic that rarely makes it into textbooks. It was not ignorance, it was fragmentation. As the planetary signals intensified, societies did not fail because they lacked knowledge. They failed because that knowledge became divided, held by priests but not builders, by astronomers but not farmers, by elites but not the whole civilization. Information existed, but it was siloed, localized, disconnected. When the final threshold was crossed, coordination collapsed before the environment did. This may be the most important lesson the ancient world left behind. The monuments were not built for rulers, they were built for alignment. Alignment with the land, with the sky, with each other. The global grid was not just a map of energy, it was a map of cooperation. A planetary system that only functioned if every part acknowledged it was part of a larger whole. When that unity fractured, the system failed. This reframes the sudden disappearances seen in the archaeological record. The cities did not all fall because the disasters were identical. They fell because they were no longer synchronized. Some regions prepared for floods, while others prepared for fire. Some reinforced coastlines, while others retreated inland. The cycle required a planetary response. What it received was a regional one. And now the same danger emerges again. Modern humanity has unprecedented access to information, yet it is more fragmented than ever. Data exists everywhere, but understanding is scattered. One group watches the magnetic field, another studies climate, another models solar storms, another tracks genetic anomalies. Rarely are these pieces assembled into a single picture. The ancient builders understood that separation was fatal. That may be why their final message was not written as a single text, but distributed across disciplines. Stone for architects, stars for astronomers, stories for the public, biology for descendants. No one group could hold the whole truth alone. It required synthesis, which raises a quiet, uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the greatest threat is not the cycle itself, but our inability to see it together. The genetic awakenings, the monument resonances, the environmental signals, the sudden leaps in intuition and technology. These are not random. They are converging. The question is whether human awareness will converge with them. Because there is a narrow window in every cycle, a moment where feedback becomes acceleration, where small choices ripple into irreversible outcomes. The ancient world reached that moment without realizing what it was. By the time they understood, the collapse was already underway. We are approaching that same window now, but unlike them, we have memory. We have pattern recognition. We have the ability to compare 6 endings instead of living through one blindly. The past does not guarantee survival. It offers opportunity. An opportunity, if ignored, becomes repetition. The monuments do not demand worship. The DNA does not demand belief. The cycle does not demand fear. None of these require faith. They require attention. Because the final stage of every previous collapse did not begin with catastrophe. It began with dismissal, with the belief that warnings were exaggerations, that patterns were coincidences, that the present was too advanced to repeat the past. Every civilization thought it was different. That belief may be the most dangerous constant of all. As the signals intensify, as the alignments return, as the ancient patterns rise to the surface of modern life, humanity stands at the exact point where history stops being something we study and becomes something we decide. The cycle does not care what we believe, but whether we remember may determine whether this is the 7th ending or the first interruption. There is a moment that arrives at the end of every long cycle when the past stops speaking in fragments and begins speaking as a single voice. That moment is not loud. It does not arrive with fire or flood. It arrives quietly, when enough pieces finally align that denial becomes harder than recognition. This is where we are now. The ancient civilizations did not fail because they lacked intelligence, technology, or foresight. They failed because they reached the limits of what isolated knowledge could do. Each age carried fragments of truth, but no age before ours ever held all of them at once. Stone remembered one thing. Myth remembered another. Biology remembered something else entirely. The cycle ensured that no single civilization could see the full pattern in time. Until now, for the first time, humanity holds archaeology, genetics, astronomy, geology, climate science, and global communication simultaneously. For the first time, the signals encoded in monuments can be compared with the signals written in DNA. For the first time, the sky above us can be modeled against the layers beneath our feet in real time. The ancient world could only warn. We can verify. That alone changes everything. The realization that follows is not comforting, but it is clarifying. The cycle is real, but it is not absolute. It has boundaries, thresholds, variables. The past shows us that collapse was not caused by one force, but by convergence. Fire, water, darkness, ice, fragmentation, and delay. Remove even one element, and the outcome shifts. The 8th civilization may not be the strongest in history, but it is the most aware. And awareness introduces a new variable the cycle has never encountered before: choice. The monuments were never meant to save the ancient world. They were meant to speak across time. The genetic memory was never meant to preserve the past. It was meant to activate in the future. The warnings were not instructions to flee, but to synchronize. If previous civilizations fell because they acted alone, then survival may depend on acting together. Not as nations, not as ideologies, but as a species that finally recognizes it shares a single planet moving through a single rhythm. This is the meaning behind the global grid, the repeating geometries, the shared alignments. They are not relics of power. They are diagrams of cooperation, blueprints for planetary thinking in an age when planetary forces dominate. The ancient builders did not fail because they were wrong. They failed because they were early. We are late, late enough to inherit their mistakes, late enough to inherit their knowledge, late enough to recognize the pattern before it completes. And this is the final truth the past offers us. History is not a warning of what will happen. It is a record of what happens when awareness arrives too slowly. The cycle does not ask whether we believe in it. It only asks whether we respond differently this time. If humanity fractures, the pattern completes. If humanity synchronizes, the pattern bends. This is not prophecy, it is precedent. Every civilization before ours left behind fragments and hoped someone would one day see the whole. That hope has quietly reached its destination. The story does not end here because the ending was never written. It waits for a decision.